So why did Crown Royal just piss off a bunch of Canadians? That's the question I'm looking at today because Doug Ford just poured a huge bottle of Crown Royal on the ground in front of a whole press corps just to show how pissed off he was at this iconic Canadian brand. You see, Crown Royal is more than just a whiskey. It's part of Canadian history, and it was crafted for a king. In 1939, King George VI and his wife, Queen Elizabeth, better known as the Queen Mum, yes, Queen Elizabeth's parents, or King Charles's grandparents, came to Canada in 1939, and they were the first sitting monarchs to visit this great country. To commemorate the moment and pay tribute to the monarch, Seagram's decided they were going to craft a luxurious whiskey. Now, according to the records, they tried about 500 times. Whether or not you believe that's a bit of an exaggeration or not, they tried to craft a special Canadian whiskey. And they adopted the monarch image for their brand. The bottle was crafted to look like the crown that you put on the king or queen for coronation, so the special coronation crown. It was also the colors that they adopted, the purple and gold of monarchy, of luxury. In fact, if you are a Canadian who was a kid in the 70s, 80s, and before, so between 1939 and the 90s, you probably have seen or had one of those purple velveteen bags with the gold rope to shut the bag to keep those marbles inside. Maybe some Scrabble letters, perhaps some toy soldiers, or just those things that you didn't want your sibling to find. This brand was all about the monarch. That was the point of it. And it was to pay tribute to our monarch, because King George VI was the King of Canada, the Dominion of Canada at the time. It's a connection between Canada and our colonial masters, if you want to call them that, the British Crown. And today we still have that connection to Britain, and the King Charles III is our King of Canada today. Now, the monarchy may or may not be a big deal to you. I mean, we see them on TV all the time, or they're in our news, we read about them. And if you're in Canada, you're like, well, it's not that they're on our money, but not all of our money, and it's not really that big of a deal. But back in 1939, having the monarch come and visit was a big deal. It was issued with a lot of fanfare. And this whiskey was to commemorate that moment in time. The thing with Seagram's is it was a family business. And by the time 1939 came around and Samuel, oh, I can't remember that. Oh, I'm so bad with names. Anyway, it's not about Seagram's, it's about Crown Royal itself. The owner of Seagram's was the guy that started up, got big. And just like any family owned company where the first generation creates this business of to the point of generational wealth and then pass it on to their kid, and their kid passes it on to their kid, and their kid passes it on to their kid. Eventually, you're going to end up with a kid that isn't really supposed to be, or doesn't really have the skill to be at the top of that company, and makes a lot of bad choices that inevitably ends up on the chopping block. And that's what happened with Seagram's. And Crown Royal was bought by Diageo in the UK. Now, Diageo is a conglomerate, and they have a ton of different brands, everything from Guinness to Crown Royal, Johnny Walker, bunch of different brands. Just wiki it and find out if you want a list of all the brands that Diageo has. And they're a UK company. So it's no longer owned by a Canadian company. Crown Royal is now owned by a UK company, which is still in line with Canadian history, Canadian identity. But just like any colonial, the colony isn't really considered, isn't really important to the powers that be. Now, Canada has been a nation since 1867. It was a dominion until 1982. In 1982, we became a nation of Canada. So we're relatively a new country. And I would argue that although we are a nation, although we are sovereign and we can stand on our own 2 feet, we have always been treated as a colony, first by the UK and then by the US. So it's part of our identity, is my point. So what happened? Why is Doug Ford pouring Crown Royal on the ground? Why are Canadians demanding that we boycott it? What happened? Well, Diageo in the UK made a decision and made an announcement of that decision that they were going to shut the bottling or production of Crown Royal in Ontario. They're going to shut it down and move it to the States. So basically, unemploy 200 Canadians and employ a bunch of Americans to bottle the American market portion of production. So all the American Crown Royal would be bottled in America and then distributed. And at first you think, okay, but if you read the newsletter or the news release, the news release says that the production will continue in Gimli, Manitoba, because that's where it started. Gimli, Manitoba was chosen in 1939 to be the distillery, the manufacturing center for Crown Royal, because of the purity of the water, access to the grains that the farmers were growing, and the weather. That's right, the weather. I guess because it gets warm in the summer and then really cold in the winter, that was really good for distilling whiskey, especially Crown Royal whiskey. So in the newsletter from Diageo, the distillery would still stay in Gimli, Manitoba. And bottlers for all the non-US markets were going to stay in Quebec. So there was going to continue jobs, and it makes sense. You got Canadian and non-US production happening in Quebec, you got the distillery happening in Gimli, and you got the bottling happening in the States for American distribution. You think, okay, well, if they're trying to avoid tariffs, that makes sense. Stop. They're CUSMA compliant, unless all of a sudden all that water and all those grains aren't Canadian. I mean, unless they're like importing all the grain from China all of a sudden. Crown Royal is 100% Canadian produced, which means it's CUSMA compliant and goes over the border at 0% tariffs. So avoiding a tariff, at least in the short run, isn't really a reason to remove 200 Canadian jobs. So let's think about it a little bit further. We know that Trump doesn't want CUSMA in place. He wants to tariff all of Canada, just like he wants to tariff the rest of the world. But CUSMA has a life until 2036, though it is being reviewed next year. And we are expecting that Trump will do something that will result in, perhaps, more than likely, it getting ripped up, unless Carney and his team can save it, along with the Mexicans and their team, because let's face it, there's three countries in this agreement. So let's say Trump gets his way and CUSMA is torn up next year. Then that makes sense, right? That we have the American bottling in America. Wait, not so fast. What happens when there is no CUSMA? And that Crown Royal that's been created at the distillery in Gimli all of a sudden has to cross the border to get to America to be bottled. If you answered that it would be charged tariffs, you are correct. So if there is no CUSMA and the distillery is still in Gimli, Manitoba, then it still makes no sense to have moved 200 jobs south of the border. So is it a sign that maybe Gimli distiller they're going to move some of the Gimli distillery down to the States? Maybe that kind of on the horizon? I don't know because it's not in their news release. They haven't said anything. But let's keep that in the back of our minds because that would piss off even more Canadians. um, but how important is it to have the distribution or the bottling production in the States? Well, when you compare the Canadian market to the American market, America's going to win every single time. We're an eighth of the size of their population, a tenth of their GDP. It's going to get better now that Trudeau's gone and Carney is in with a build mandate. But for right now, Canadians' economy isn't the size of the American economy. Now, back in, before there was a lot more options in the whiskey world, Crown Royal made up 60% of all whiskey sales in Canada. And it's just gone down to about 40%. So 40% on average of all the whiskeys purchases in Canada are Crown Royal. Will that go down now? Let's just say that Jack Daniels isn't feeling the love with 67% less sales in Canada. And that, yes, is due to the fact that they're not even on the shelves. But even being on the shelves in Alberta and Saskatchewan and being on the shelves in January, February, that's still a big cut to their bottom line. But in America, Crown Royal is the #1 Canadian whiskey of all the Canadian whiskeys purchased in America. So Crown Royal, looking at the American market, is kind of important to them. I get that. You get that. The world gets that. But why move 200 jobs? You're still going to be selling that whiskey just like you are today, just like you did last year from Ontario, shipping it from Ontario down into the States. So there still is no reason even then to have moved those 200 jobs. Why is it such a big deal to Canadians that you move those 200 jobs? Why is Ford so upset? Well, because we're in a trade war, folks, and we all know that. Now, it's not just that we're in a trade war, because really, Canada's got the best deal. It's CUSMA. We have a few disagreements when it comes to a few industries. And that's manageable for Canada to try and save in the Canadian market. But there's something else going on. There's some reason why Canadians are so mad and so pissed off that they are trying to do whatever they can to make a negative impact on the American economy. And that is because Trump wants to annex Canada. The whole annexing of Canada, the whole saying that you don't need anything that we have, Trump going on about we don't need your forest, we don't need your electricity, we don't need your oil, we don't need your water, we don't need anything that Canada has. We know that that's not right. And we feel betrayed. We feel belittled. We feel no value. We feel unvalued, I guess, if that's not a word, but you get what I mean. So Canadians feel like we've been dissed by the Americans, that we've been kind of thrown aside as not important and completely unappreciated, even though we have been there for them time after time after time. So we have this negative feeling about things, when we see that we're losing something and it's going into the States. The States is winning, Canada's losing, we feel something negative. So when Diageo announces, hey, we're going to cut 200 jobs, move them down, but we're leaving everything else, we're going to ignore the we're leaving anything else and only focus on the fact that we're losing 200 jobs in Ontario to benefit the Americans. And that's going to piss a bunch of Canadians off right now because we are feeling so unappreciated, unvalued, and betrayed. And now that feeling is being directed to Diageo. We're feeling those feelings towards them. Because Canadians, like I said before, this Crown Royal brand was created here. It is distilled here. It is part of us and part of our identity and part of our history. And Diego isn't respecting that. Just like as if they were the monarch to a colony. And they didn't take the temperature of Canadians very accurately. They didn't understand the level of anger and vindictiveness that the Canadians have towards anything that would be seen as not being of benefit to the Canadians and giving something to the Americans. Not sure why they didn't see that, considering that it's all over the news. But that's really what it comes down to. So why did they piss Canadians off? Why would they make that choice, knowing that Canadians already have this feeling of anger towards America? Does it have something to do with the promised investments that the UK Prime Minister promised to Trump and now are investing their share into America because the UK has said that they would? Or is there another reason why they're doing it? That is what we'd like to know in Canada. We'd love to know why. If we understand the reasoning of this decision, we're very forgiving. In fact, all Trump really has to do is say sorry and mean it, and Canadians would probably be a little less vindictive. But Diego has to do something else. They're not only going to have to say sorry, they're going to have to explain their reasoning. Why is it so important to them to take these jobs away from Canadians and give them to Americans? Why are they putting their foot into this dispute between Canada and the US? Well, those are the questions for today. If you have an answer, please let me know in the comments. I would love to know the reason why, and if it is a good reason. If you are boycotting Crown Royal, let me know. If you think Canadians should buy Crown Royal anyway, let me know. Because Canada, right now, we have a chance to be a nation and no longer a colony, or to no longer be treated as a colony. That's what we want. We want to keep our manufacturing. We want to keep our businesses. We want to stop them from going across the border into the States. We are tired of Americans coming up and buying our iconic brands like Big Pickles, like Crown Royal, but that was the UK. We're tired of other people coming in and buying our brands and removing our jobs because all they want is our resources. We're more than our resources. We deserve those jobs up the supply chain. We have skilled workers here that can do the jobs up the value chain. And that's what Canadians want. That's what Canadians are fighting for. We are fighting to be taken seriously and no longer be taken advantage of. Let me know your thoughts. And until next time, peel out.